Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Theodore Roosevelt, and the focus is the Taft Rift. The year is 1908, and Roosevelt is finishing up his presidency. A lot of people are pushing him to run for another term, but he agrees to stick with his original pledge back on election night that he would not seek a third term. And instead, because of his popularity, he gets the chance to do something that really only one president had ever done. That's pick his successor. Andrew Jackson had done the same for Martin Van Buren, seemed like 100 years before, and now it was Roosevelt's term, and he really had two choices. He had his Secretary of State, Elihu, that he actually thought would be the best president, but he goes with William Howard Taft, who is currently his Secretary of War and one of his closest friends, as he believes he would be the best candidate for president. So Taft runs for office, he wins the presidency. Roosevelt is kind enough to get out of the way. In fact, he goes on a safari and a trip to Europe, takes him out of the country for over a year. He's confident, while being gone, that Taft is still the right man. He says Taft will carry on the work substantially as I have carried it on. His policies, principles, purposes, and ideals are the same as mine. I have the profound satisfaction of knowing that he will do all in his power to further every one of the great causes for which I have fought. That's what he thought. Then he comes back and things are not quite as he had anticipated. In fact, even before he gets back to the United States, he took a visit from Gifford Pinchot, who had been one of his leaders in the conservation movement within the Department of the Interior. And Pinchot reports that Taft is backsliding on a lot of the progressive policies that Roosevelt had advocated so strongly for. And so Roosevelt's a little bit on edge when he gets back into the country in June of 1910. In fact, he declines an invitation from the president to come to the White House. He says that would not be appropriate for a former president, and Taft is a little bit irked by this. The two do get together a couple of months later at Taft's summer home in Beverly, Massachusetts, but it's a very strained meeting. They're not even sure what to call each other. They chit-chat for about an hour, but again, not very friendly and cordial, as both are a little bit on edge. Well, then a bunch of progressives start showing up at Sagamore Hill, the Roosevelt home, one after another complaining about Taft. He's too conservative. He's too aligned with the money men in New York. He's not progressive enough. He's not Rooseveltian, as Theodore Roosevelt had anticipated he would be. Well, Roosevelt's not ready to break with Taft, but he is ready to push his agenda, and so he decides to go on a speaking tour. He heads west for 3 weeks, and in one of his most important addresses in Osawatomie, Kansas, he unveils what he calls his new nationalism. Now, this is progressivism on steroids. He's not only talking about regulations on labor, he's focusing on men and women, banning on corporate funds in terms of politics. He wants real tariff reform, and he's pushing for a constitutional amendment to get a progressive income tax against the wealthy, a bunch of other policies as well. This is starting to cause a real rupture within the Republican Party, and President Taft isn't very happy about it. One of the movements that Roosevelt is pushing for is something called judicial recall. And in this idea, the people would have the opportunity to overrule the courts if they had a sufficient vote to do so on a particular decision. This really gets at the sensibilities of Taft, who frankly wanted to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court more than he wanted to be President of the United States. And he thought this was just an attack on that entire branch of government. So Taft is on edge, Roosevelt is on edge, and then the midterm elections roll around, and the Republicans are hammered. All of a sudden, a lot of movement in place for Roosevelt to run again for the Republican nomination in 1912. Throughout the year of 1911, he's actually pushing back against these movements to get him to run again. But then something happens. The Taft administration files an antitrust suit against U.S. Steel. This is in October of 1911. And the principal reason was because U.S. Steel had bought Tennessee Iron and Coal, giving them more than a majority of market share across the country. When did they do that? When Theodore Roosevelt was president, during a recession in 1907. And Roosevelt had pretty much said, don't worry about antitrust. We need this to be done because it'll be good for the economy. And now he sees this as really a shot directly at his own reputation, his integrity. He complains that Taft was in those meetings. He didn't complain back then. Now he's starting to think maybe things have turned and he does need to run. In fact, he puts out feelers that if governors would send him a letter to draft him, that he'd actually be interested in getting into the race for the Republican nomination. What is he saying about Taft at this time? Well, he says, I am really sorry for Taft. I'm sure he means well, but he means well feebly. He is utterly unfit for leadership, and this is a time when we need leadership. All kinds of people influence him on the unimportant things where he does know his own mind, but generally makes up his mind wrong. And on the important things, he does not know his own mind and changes it every which way. These are former best friends who are clearly now in a political divide. Roosevelt gets his letter from the governors that he's looking for, and in February of 1912, he tosses his hat into the ring. He is running for the Republican nomination. Now, not only is Taft completely distraught over this, really not even sure what he did to offend Roosevelt so much. Again, this was the man he considered his best friend who is now turning on him politically and feeling personally. The Republican Party is not terribly happy with Roosevelt over this either, including a lot of other Roosevelt's friends. Henry Cabot Lodge, Elihu Root, core members of the Republican Party that had been part of his administration and longtime friends, they don't want Roosevelt to run because they know what's going to happen. It's going to divide the party. And sure enough, that's what starts to happen. Roosevelt takes advantage of the fact that there are now primary elections in a number of states. So he goes straight to the people. Instead of the party bosses picking the delegates for the convention in all states, he starts running in primaries. And he starts winning one after another, beating Taft handily, including in Taft's home state of Ohio. But then there's confusion. The convention takes place in June in Chicago, and it's not that unusual for them to be disputed delegates that the Credentials Committee needs to decide whom to seat. But nearly 25% of the delegates were disputed at this particular election. And one of the main reasons was, again, this confusion on the switch from state legislatures choosing the delegates versus the primaries. And Taft pretty much has the traditional Republican Party behind him. So Roosevelt kind of smells a rat. He thinks he's going to get robbed of the nomination, so he races to Chicago. He gives a big speech to his supporters, and sure enough, the Credentials Committee meets, and almost every delegate seat that was disputed goes to Taft. So now Roosevelt is up in arms, and he claims the convention is now composed, has no claim to represent the voters of the Republican Party. It represents nothing but successful fraud and overriding the will of the rank and file of the party. Any man nominated by the convention as now constituted would be merely the beneficiary of this successful fraud. Roosevelt doesn't just stop there. After Taft is nominated by the Republican Party, he and his progressives bolt to the other side of town, and they say, we're not going to take this. We're going to start our own party. And they come back in August of that year and formally have their own convention. Roosevelt is nominated for president along with Hiram Johnson of California as his VP, and he's going to take on not only the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, but also the incumbent president from his old party, the Republicans, William Howard Taft. It is a tumultuous campaign, and Roosevelt, interestingly, doesn't spend a lot of time focusing on Taft. He really goes after Wilson, as he believes Wilson is the greatest a stumbling block to him winning the presidency and getting back to the White House. Well, this crazy of all campaigns takes another twist in October. In fact, on October the 14th, a man by John Schrank steps out. Roosevelt is coming out of his hotel in Milwaukee, and Schrank, from about 30 feet away, raises a pistol and fires a shot, hits Roosevelt in the chest. Hits him in the chest. He staggers for a moment, but then he realizes he's, in his words, not coughing up blood, so he's probably okay. And what happens is the bullet goes through his coat and goes through two objects, his speech that planned for that day and his glasses case. And both of those objects slow down the bullet so that, yes, it gets through his shirt and into his body, but he feels like he's actually okay, and he's determined to give his speech for that day. In fact, he says, I will deliver this speech or die, one or the other. Well, they tried to talk him out of it. They couldn't. Roosevelt gets to give his speech. In fact, he shows his bloody shirt to the audience in Milwaukee about the fact that he had just been shot, but But he says that's not going to slow me down. He goes on and attacks Taft, he attacks Wilson, and he's then goes to the hospital where he spends the next couple of weeks leading up to the end of the campaign. The election results are not a surprise. The second Roosevelt decided to run as a third party, he handed the election to Woodrow Wilson because all he did was split the party that had traditionally been Republican. The result was completely overwhelming, where Wilson wins 82% in the Electoral College, even though Taft and Roosevelt combined to have a greater popular vote than Wilson. Wilson's 42% in the popular vote was one of the lowest of all time. Only Lincoln's from 1860 was actually lower. But Wilson wins 40 states, Taft gets 2, Roosevelt comes in with 6, and the third party idea simply does not work. Roosevelt ends Taft's political career, and he effectively hands power to what would become his new political enemy, Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats. But that is the story for another day. That is Theodore Roosevelt and the Taft Rift, from the life of Theodore Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.